In this video, we'll be learning how to calculate the circumference of a circle. So before we begin, make sure you either have this digitally pulled up or printed off. We first need to go over some important parts of a circle, illustrated by the three examples above. The first one, if you notice, is a line that looks like it goes from the outside to the center of a circle. So it goes halfway across. This line is called a radius. If it goes the full way across, so from end to end, passing through the center, that is called a diameter. And then finally, the distance around the circle, normally that's called a perimeter for other shapes, but for a circle, it's called the circumference. So taking a little break from our notes for a second, perimeter is also the distance around a two-dimensional shape. And we normally find it by adding the sides together. So if I look at both this rectangle and this triangle, I could just add up the sides. So for the rectangle, I could make my way around and do 3 plus 5 plus 3 plus 5. You might have thought of some shortcuts for that. And I would get that that perimeter would be 16. For the triangle, I could do the same thing of 3 plus 4 plus 5. And I would get a perimeter of 12. So this leads us to a problem of what would we do for a circle? Because circles don't really have side lengths. It's almost one continuous side. So what this video will try to do is explain how to calculate the circumference for a circle. Believe it or not, we actually enlist the help of a famous number for this, of pi. So pi is the ratio of any circle's circumference, and again, that's the distance around the outside, to its diameter, which is the distance across a circle. So as an equation, we could write that pi is equal to circumference divided by diameter. Now, our goal is to calculate the circumference. So if we think about as an equation, the goal is to get c by itself. I want circumference. So to do that, I could multiply both sides by diameter, and that would give me that circumference is equal to pi times the diameter. And believe it or not, that's our first formula of the circumference is equal to pi times the diameter. So as long as you know the diameter, you'll be able to calculate circumference using that famous number of pi. We're going to start by calculating circumference using the diameter because we just talked about that formula is c is equal to pi times diameter. So here in these two examples, I know I have my diameter because the line goes the full distance across. So that means that c equals pi d is a great formula to use here. So what I'm going to do is plug in these values into the d variable in this formula. So for the first one, I would have pi times 5. Now there's actually two ways to write your final answer. The first way is called in terms of pi, and you don't actually multiply by pi. So what I would do instead is I would just want to reorder this answer right here, and we like our numbers in front. So it would be 5 pi, and units on circumference are just flat units, not squared or anything. Now, if I wanted to actually round that answer, I would do 5 times 3.14 to get what that would approximately be. So 5 times pi, or 5 times 3.14, is equal to 15.7 feet. Now, something to point out, since this is the first time we've been doing this, is these two answers are actually the same. And you can think of this almost like fractions and decimals. There are two ways to write values, but 1/2 and 0.5 are worth the same. Same thing here. 5 pi means that you would do 5 times pi. Now, some people prefer in terms of pi because it's impossible to write what that would fully be in decimals. Because remember, pi is a number that goes on forever. So you would have to round it if you were trying to write the decimals. So just as kind of some side notes, this is seen as more precise because you can avoid rounding. I would like for you to think of it almost like a fraction. Okay, so kind of like writing 1/3 is seen as more precise than writing 0.33 because 0.33 would go on forever and you couldn't write it all. So those two are the same. So if we look at the next example, I have that my diameter is 11 centimeters. So again, pi times diameter, here my diameter is 11. So in terms of pi, would just be reordering that as 11 pi centimeters. And if I were to actually want to round that, I would take my calculator and do 11 times 3.14, and that would give me an answer of 34.54 centimeters. Now, if you're looking ahead in your notes, you'll see that now we transition to what if we had the radius instead of the diameter. So for that second formula, we're going to look at what we see in terms of diameter and a radius. If we overlap them on the same circle, we see that here would be my radius, all the way across is my diameter. And hopefully what you would notice is, well, I could put another radius here to go that full distance across. So what this is saying is that a diameter is the same thing as 2 radii, or 2 times your radius. So what that means is if instead I have my radius, I could plug this in the location of the diameter. So my formula would be C equals pi times 2r. Now, I don't know about you, but that looks a little messy, and I think it's just because in math, we normally see the number first. So what you're going to write in your notes is not pi 2r, but instead 2 pi r. But up above, that kind of shows you where that comes from. So in these two examples, I know I have my radius because that line only goes halfway. So instead of pi d, I'm instead thinking 2 pi r. So in this first example, I would be plugging in 3 as my r value. And when I'm focusing on in terms of pi, here I'll zoom in now that we have that formula, I really just want to multiply the other numbers involved. So to get my answer in terms of pi, I would take 2 times 3 and say that would be 6 pi. Again, in terms of pi, I'm not actually going to multiply those. I leave the pi symbol there. So then rounded, I would take 6 times 3.14, and I would get 18.84. Again, these two values are worth the same, just two different ways to write them. In my final example, I have 2 times pi times my radius of 35. In terms of pi, I'd want to do 2 times 35 to get 70 pi inches. And then to round that, I would want to take my calculator and actually do 70 times 3.14, and I get 219.8 inches. So in summary, you have two different options for calculating the circumference. The first thing you can do is if you're given that diameter and it goes all the way across, if so, you're thinking C equals pi times D. If instead you're only given a line that goes halfway across, that's the radius, and you would calculate it doing 2 times pi times r. There's two ways to format your answers. The first being in terms of pi, think of that like a fraction. You don't use your calculator and you leave the pi symbol on your answer. So you're not actually multiplying times 3.14. Rounded, however, you would grab that calculator and actually do the times 3.14 to get a decimal version of your answer.